Each year, as our artificial calendars say the old year is running out, millions or billions of us set New Year's resolutions to perhaps drink less or get a new job, to get a promotion or to run a marathon. But are these resolutions a golden opportunity for self-improvement, or are they just a trap that leads us towards unfulfillment? And can philosophy give us a new and better way of setting New Year's resolutions that leads more reliably towards fulfillment rather than dissatisfaction? A huge welcome back to Surprising Ethics, the podcast that always promises a surprising idea drawn from ethics or political philosophy in every single episode. I'm your host, William Gilday, a researcher in McGill University's Department of Philosophy and the Centre for Research in Ethics. And I want to thank the Centre for Research in Ethics, an academic centre based in Montreal, for their really kind support of this podcast. So in this episode on the philosophy of New Year's resolutions, we start as always with the status quo. So the status quo says, look, with the new year, we should be reflecting on our past and setting aims for the future. We should be getting out of bad habits that we've slipped into and be taking opportunities to become more productive and ultimately more happy. Now, we might see this as a moral obligation to others. We might see it as just a good thing to do to help ourselves. Or in a middle ground, we might see it as a kind of duty to the self. But the normal way to set a New Year's resolution is to come up with a kind of specific, measurable target, a target you can complete, a target you can work towards and tick off the list. So this episode will look at two philosophical challenges to this status quo view, both of which I think contain surprises. The first one is a more general rejection of New Year's resolutions, and the second one is a more nuanced rejection of some resolutions in favour of other types. So the first challenge we can call the pro-idleness challenge. And this critique says, look, these New Year's resolutions come from and kind of reinforce our society's unhealthy obsession with productivity, with doing more, doing it faster, doing it better year on year. Our political cultures obsess over growth, and more growth. And our employers want output, sales, deliverables faster and faster each year. You might think, well, this is a modern obsession and New Year's resolutions have been around for a very long time, but it's not. Here's the alternative productivity guru, Oliver Burkeman.
When you feel overwhelmed, what do? If you're anything like me, you try to fit more into the available time. You try to become more productive and efficient. You try to stop yourself checking Twitter and Facebook all day long on your phone. You try to hustle harder and harder and harder to get on top of everything at last. This is a way of thinking about time that we've borrowed from the Industrial Revolution. And back then it was a pretty good way to get machines in factories to operate more efficiently. It's even a pretty good way to get the workers with those machines in factories to operate more efficiently, so long as you don't actually care about their well-being. What's happened is that we've internalized this ethos of discipline and efficiency and productivity, and now we try to drive ourselves like machines, even though we're not machines.
And the historian Eleanor Mary touched on a similar theme in an Aeon essay of hers, where she charts the rise of the diary in 19th century Victorian England. She writes that
the great Victorian innovation in diary keeping was the switch from the use of the diary solely as a means of reflecting on past actions to the use of pre-printed diaries to plan the future. Diaries were no longer just a record of experience. They were an organizational tool. A mania for progress, industry, and commerce had seized the nation. Trade was flourishing in the bustling capital, and these new times generated new commodities. Tasks, appointments, memoranda, all could be jotted down in a neatly structured pocket diary that would help you use your time as productively as possible.
Now, we might think that nothing has shrunk distances and accelerated time more than the internet, but Eleanor Mary notes how wristwatches, clocks, trains, train timetables, telegraph wires, the postal system, and the new standard of time in Britain Greenwich Mean Time, introduced in 1880, had a revolutionary impact on how people perceive time and productivity. And here's one more snippet from her.
The cultural historian John Gillis states that no well-managed household could afford to be without a full complement of clocks and calendars carefully synchronized to the beat of the new industrial and political order.
Now here's more evidence that there's little new about our culture of overwork. 93 years ago, the philosopher Bertrand Russell published an essay called In Praise of Idleness, a damning criticism of hyperproductivity and Victorian morals. Now, Russell was a famous philosopher. He was an aristocrat who railed against the aristocracy, an activist and a proponent of free love who got expelled from Cambridge University for anti-war campaigning. And he was a highly well-regarded public intellectual who was thrown in jail at the age of 89 near the end of his long career for his political protests. And before getting into Russell, the briefest requests to consider hitting follow if you haven't already done so. It really helps getting this podcast to more people. Russell's clarion call is this: let's not aim as a society to be more productive, because we're embedded in this kind of crazy system that treats work as an end in itself, as something that's never in need of justification, whereas leisure and sitting around doing nothing is in need of justification in our society. Russell claims that work is not among the ends of human life, and we've lost sight of how we should be working. We should be working so that we have enough to live, and then stop working when we have enough and start enjoying leisure time. And he says, well, maybe you think leisure isn't all that great, but if you do, you're just wrapped up in this system of work, 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 and no leisure time, because you have no time for decent leisure time. He draws a distinction between passive and active leisure. And of course, passive leisure, like watching Netflix, isn't normally all that great. But if we had more time for active leisure, leisure in which we take an active role, we definitely would have a better view of leisure. Russell claimed that people should be working 4-hour days. And once we release people from painful overwork and give them a shot at a happy life, we'd cultivate a virtuous population. We'd live in a more just world, and people would be free to pursue all sorts of projects that they want to pursue without needing to be paid for them. And so maybe Russell would be suspicious of any New Year's resolutions that stem from this kind of ideology of work, in his view. The idea that it's good and virtuous to work and shameful to be idle. He might think little of suggestions that we do these 6 things each morning at 6 a.m. or fit the gym in before our already overly long workday. He might think that this stems from a kind of failure to see the big picture, that life lies away from work in the traditional sense, in both leisure as we know it and in a more enlightened and active leisure in which we produce creatively. But I'd suggest that Russell's kind of broadside against productivity doesn't undermine nearly all New Year's resolutions. Right, for one thing, it might make sense for a student to try to find ways to be more productive because of their need to work towards financial security. And then only once they have a permanent job that pays the bills can they reject the productivity lifestyle. And Russell might accept that because his essay is targeted at social norms and the economic system, not necessarily how individuals make decisions within the existing structure. But there's also a kind of deeper criticism of any Russell-inspired attack on New Year's resolutions. Here's a quote from Russell: "The road to happiness and prosperity lies in an organised diminution of work." But we might disagree with that, because we might need productivity in some sense to live in a just and happy world. Economists define productivity in terms of dollars of output per hour worked. But if we reject that definition and define productivity in terms of socially valuable work or in terms of contributions towards defensible social goals, like making the world a more just place, we might want to maximise that kind of productivity rather than rejecting productivity in all its senses. I think the thought here is, can we really afford to be idle when people are starving, when injustice is all around us, when we're oppressing animals and cutting down rainforests and burning our world to pieces? Don't we need a kind of more just and pro-social productivity, rather than saying the way forwards is towards a kind of insular leisure? Russell does say, well, look, if each of us had 4-hour days to work, at least some of us, he thinks at least 1% of people, would use the remaining hours for projects of huge public importance. And they'd be unconstrained, they'd be able to be original. They wouldn't need to make a living while they do it. They could just get on directly with the work that needs to be done. But we might wonder whether we can settle for that, whether 1% is enough, and whether we don't need a kind of greater effort towards fairness and a good world for all by trying to encourage a culture and a politics of social productivity. So let me assume, if I can, that even if Russell is right and that we should prefer a world of less work in the economic sense, there's still room for self-improvement and greater ethical or pro-social productivity. So let's suppose that we do want to set a New Year's resolution, but we just want to find a reasonable one that isn't the product of a kind of blind Victorian pro-work ideology. So now we can move to the work of Kieran Setiya, a professor of philosophy at MIT, who provides an argument that I think can be repurposed and applied to New Year's resolutions, and that centres on becoming more fulfilled. He tries to provide a recipe for being more fulfilled in life and suffering less from existential angst and a sense of pointlessness. I said earlier that most New Year's resolutions are concrete, completable targets. Go to the gym every day, get a promotion, or paint the house. Here are some examples of people's resolutions drawn from our delightful internet.
It's New Year's resolution season. Now is the time to improve yourself. You'll have six-pack abs by Valentine's Day. I guarantee it.
We're gonna rank New Year's resolutions, see which ones. Make a new friend. I could do that, yeah. I stretch more. I really need to do that. I can't even touch my toes. Make my bed every day. That needs to be done. But I'm saving that resolution. Did I make my bed today? Oh, I did. Soak in the sun. I'll put maybe. I want a better one. Achieve a six-pack. Yes, let's get it done by the end of the year.
Now, I think Setiya would take issue with some of these resolutions because he thinks many of us are making a big mistake in how we approach life. A mistake that leaves us feeling hollow and unfulfilled, even if we're successful in meeting our aims. He describes this process of setting an aim, such as the aim to write a book or land a job, working towards it, finally achieving it, and then just feeling hollow, just feeling unfulfilled. The puzzle, he writes, is that success can feel like a failure. And it's well known, right, that many Olympians who win gold often feel really depressed after having won gold. They're so good at what they do, they've done so much training, they've won so many grants or awards or spots on the team to get to where they are. They're then in the limelight, they're on TV, they win the gold, they party afterwards, and then it just doesn't feel like enough or doesn't feel quite right, and they can slip into depression. Why does that happen? Or more generally, how can we avoid the sense of a lack of fulfillment that can come even when things finally seem to be going well for us? Well, Setiya thinks he has the answer. He offers a distinction between telic and atelic activities, where telic is a word that comes from the Greek word telos, meaning goal. So telic activities have a goal, just as a telephone call aims at someone else's phone. So telic activities aim at an endpoint, a final state, and can be completed. So examples are walking home, writing a book, landing a job, becoming a millionaire. These are all things that can be completed. But atelic activities do not have any final state. They can't be completed. So examples are going on a wander around the city, listening to music, hanging out with family. I can ask you whether you've completed your walk home but I can't ask you whether you've completed hanging out with your family. Right? You can stop hanging out with your family, you can go to bed, but you can't complete hanging out with your family. And Setiya says, look, it's a mistake to have a life primarily built around telic activities that can be completed. He thinks that if the meaning of our lives hinges on telic activities, that's bad, because telic activities aim at their own destruction. When we're engaged in them, we're trying to get to the end. We're trying to complete them. We're trying to eradicate them from our lives, thereby destroying another source of meaning in our life. Yes, we can just find another project. We can write another book. We can aim to become a multi-millionaire rather than just a millionaire. But when we complete that further project, we'll likely find the same result. Yes, we might feel momentary satisfaction at hitting that further goal, but to quote Setiya, fulfillment lies always in the future or in the past. That is no way to live. This is all, by the way, from his book, Midlife, A Philosophical Guide. And Sam Harris says something similar to this.
Wisdom is understanding that you don't have to hold your happiness hostage until some future time where your desires get gratified. But that doesn't mean it's irrational to plan for the future. Whatever your goals, the quality of the journey has to become more important than those fleeting moments when you actually arrive at your destination. Because most of your life is the journey.
And so for Setiya, it will be a mistake for many of us, those of us who are project-oriented, who focus on outcomes and achievements rather than mainly being in the present, to go for New Year's resolutions that are telic in nature. Because although he says outcomes do matter, of course we might need to get a job, or we might need to hit a certain amount of savings so that we can finally buy a house. But Setiya thinks that many of us live our lives by projects, by achievements, by outcomes, and that we cannot really reach fulfillment in this way, because as soon as we get what we want, it's gone. The achievement goes up in smoke, and it's now in the past. We might have one good evening where we celebrate, but ultimately, these projects are engines of destruction, in his phrase. And it leaves us feeling hollow to have all of the promise of our lives in the future not yet being arrived at, not here in the present, or to have the good stuff in the past. So for Setiya, we should rebalance our lives towards atelic activities. Things like hiking, listening to music, hanging out with friends and family. And this is because when we're doing these activities, getting what we want doesn't lie in the future as something we have to race towards. What we want is already here right with us now, in the present. When we're walking home, we might want to go faster, rush through it, and just get to our house. But when we're going on a hike, that doesn't make any sense. We might have a circular route where we set off from A, only to wander around, going through the circle, to get back to A. The point of the hike was to get back to A. We wouldn't have left at all. The point, therefore, obviously can't be to finish it, to get it done, to take it off a list. And so we can see that with hiking, the point is to be in the present. What we have, what we want to hike, is already here with us. And there can be a greater sense of fulfillment about activities where we're not striving for the future or looking back to the past, but we're in the process, we're in the now, we're in the present. And so maybe a resolution that focuses on atelic activities will lead to more fulfillment than just trying to get the next project done or find a new project so that we can get through it and get it done. Okay, so I want to end with a discussion of a few objections. The first one is, isn't this just for the privileged? Isn't this focus on the unfulfillment of success just kind of for the few? In a sense, it seems to suggest that outcomes don't really matter that much. But for many people, the hollowness of success isn't the primary concern. What matters is putting food on the table, paying the bills, protecting one's family. And Setiya does admit that he is discussing a bit of a luxury problem, and that he's talking about the malaise people can feel when things are going well objectively but don't feel great subjectively. And he's clear that he's not saying that outcomes don't matter. Of course, we cannot ignore whether there's food on the table, whether there are bills to be paid. But if things are going okay economically, and yet the outcome side is all we focus on, then we might find that this isn't a recipe for fulfillment. And often this focus on success, in particular a narrow form of economic success, is kind of held out as an aim, an ideal for everyone. And I think at least Setiya's work can help us evaluate whether that ideal is the right one to hold on to. A second objection is, are you really saying that resolutions like Dry January or Veganuary are no good? Dry January is a resolution that involves not drinking alcohol for the month of January. And Veganuary is a resolution that involves trying to be vegan for a month, or at least building up to being vegan by the end of a month. These are telic goals in the sense that you can complete Veganuary, for example. So are we saying that we should focus on atelic things for New Year's and set aside goals that intuitively seem really quite good, like Dry January or Veganuary? I think this is a good point to raise, but I think people who do things like Veganuary don't see it purely in telic terms. They don't see it as simply a goal to get to the 31st of January, eating fully vegan, and then going back to normal, ticking it off the list and being like, that's done. I think they see the 31-day challenge as a way to reset, a way to reorient, a way to move into the rest of the year with a slightly different set of habits and skills and dispositions, to pay more attention in the new year to whether their values align with their actions. So I'm not saying that it doesn't make sense to do Veganuary. It's just that we might understand the January part of Veganuary not as the whole resolution, but as the practical thing that's getting us into the process of eating in a different way. Okay, final objection. If targets aren't smart targets, they won't work. It's all very well to say, focus on the process, live in the present. But resolutions like focus on the process, enjoy your family's company more, or go to the gym for its own sake, and not because it will give you a six-pack, won't work.
Most people will set what I call vague goals. It might be exercise more, eating better, getting healthy, or saving more. They're vague in the sense that how do you know when you've reached them? What does exercising more look like?
This is Scott Lear, a professor of health sciences on BBC News.
A great way for setting goals and resolutions is what we call the SMART acronym. Now, the SMART acronym stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely. A SMART goal will be something like, I want to exercise 3 times a week for 30 minutes each time. So that's specific, that's measurable, and I want to get to that goal of exercise in 3 months. So it's timely.
So we can develop this objection by going a bit deeper into the psychology of habit cultivation and behaviour change. In a paper called Time to Form a Habit, published recently in the journal Healthcare, Ben Singh and colleagues discuss how long it takes to get a habit to stick and what determines how long it takes. They suggest that planning specific details about when and where you'll perform the new activity helps in many cases, and that suggests that resolutions should be specific and completable. And they also found that early repetitions early on in the process helps, and that habits like stretching daily are easier to form in the morning than the evening, and that preparing for your habits helps. So how long does it take for a new habit to stick? Between 2 and 5 months, which is quite a lot longer than is commonly thought. But that helps, they say, to modulate people's expectations and to lead to more success. Anyway, what are we going to say about this objection? Which basically says resolutions have to be telic and goal-based, otherwise they won't work. They just won't work. Well, I think we might say resolutions have to have a telic and an atelic component, a goal-based and a process-based component. So if we want to focus more on enjoying our work rather than rushing to complete something. For example, we might track our progress in this. We might put reminders on our laptop to focus on the process. We might send ourselves delayed emails to ask us about how we're doing on this and give ourselves ticks when we've done it. If we want to see family more and enjoy their company, that doesn't mean that we can't, for example, say we want to visit them every month and track this in our diary and put at the end of each month, have we done this, and tick yes or cross no. But once we arrive at our family's home, we can leave the kind of get it done mode that's in your diary to one side and enter the process mode. So we can focus on the process whilst also having a kind of goal that we use to actually initiate that process. All right, that's basically it. If you want to hit follow in your podcast app, please do. That would be so brilliant. If you've already done that, why not consider giving the podcast 5 stars or even sharing it with a friend? That would be so helpful for getting this podcast, which is still quite new, out there into the world. And I hope philosophy will then play a bigger role in people's lives and in public debates about the things that matter. And I've created a feedback form so that you can tell me your thoughts on the podcast, whether this is the first episode you've listened to or whether you're a regular. So it'd be really great to be in dialogue with more listeners. It should take just 2 minutes to fill in, and it's in the episode notes. And thank you so much to anyone who can provide their view on the podcast. For the next episode, we'll be back to the regular first of the month timeline. So February the 1st is the next episode. But before that, do consider checking out the other episodes on animal rights, hedonism, and banning smoking and paternalism, among others. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate your company here, and I hope you have a great new year.